everybody wants to get united. Like, what we gotta do is meet everybody on 149th Street at the bench.
Today we have ourselves a pretty controversial video because I'm going to be talking all about anti-style. Now there's 3 different categories of anti-style we're going to talk about in today's video. We're going to go over each of them and explain why some of these don't quite work and all of them aren't what you think. All the while debunking some common arguments about anti-style and seeing what it is you guys think about anti-style. So what exactly is anti-style for somebody who isn't familiar with it? Well, put simply, it's when somebody intentionally ignores the fundamentals of graffiti, relying solely on style in order to produce their piece of artwork. And they're of the mindset that graffiti has no rules, and as a result, you should do graffiti without following any of the rules, which that ends up, ironically, becoming a rule that they end up following. You see, in order to continue this conversation, we first have to understand how it is art forms function as a whole, and how it is art forms are categorized. You see, every single art form under the sun follows the elements of art. This includes graffiti. If you don't believe me, try drawing graffiti without using any line, shape, form, value, space, color, or texture. Unless you're capable of breaking reality, then you're not going to be able to disprove that. Now try writing your name without using any letter structure, negative space management, letter name weight, letter name positioning, and flow. You also can't do that. This means graffiti, just like any other art form, factually has rules it abides by. And this leads us right into how it is art forms are categorized. You see, every single art form under the sun is categorized by its fundamental set. These are the rules that apply to a specific art form, not to all art forms. Just to give you an example, the fundamentals that apply to portraiture are not the same fundamentals that apply to landscapes. You don't need anatomy in order to draw a landscape. So each and every single art form abides by its own set of fundamentals. And these fundamentals are needed in order to actually partake in that art form. For example, if you wanted to draw a cartoon character, but you drew a hyper-realistic Mona Lisa looking painting, then guess what? You didn't follow cartoon's fundamentals, and as a result, you didn't draw a cartoon. And that's a definitive fact. This is how all art forms are categorized. You have one section of anti-style that does a really great job of ignoring all of graffiti's fundamentals. As a result, this category of anti-style actually doesn't have any of graffiti's fundamentals, and it ends up becoming something totally different. Something so far from graffiti, you can't categorize it as graffiti. And it ends up becoming more of an abstract art. Why? Well, because it shares the same art form specific fundamentals as some abstract arts depending on how you go about doing it. And it lacks all of the art form specific fundamentals of graffiti, so you can't categorize it as such. In the case of this particular style of anti-style, there's no reason to give it a new name such as anti-style because it already is an art form that exists, which would be some category of abstract art depending on how you go about doing it. In short, this form of anti-style isn't graffiti at all and ends up just becoming abstract art. Now here's the thing, I actually really like some anti-styles more along this path because for those of you guys who don't know, I actually studied abstract art for quite some time and I love abstract art. So when I see anti-styles more so in this category, I actually really love them. But once again, you can't really call them anti-styles because they're just a different abstract art. But what about the anti-styles that do have letter structure and are more similar to what graffiti is? Even in that case, you still can't call it anti-style. And the reason for that is because in order to make a new subcategory of an art form, you have to build a fundamental set that differentiates it from its initial parent art form. For example, 3D graffiti is a subcategory of graffiti, and it's defined as its own subcategory because it follows a slightly different fundamental set than normal graffiti. You have to follow the initial art form specific fundamentals with slight variations. So if this style of anti-style wanted to develop itself as its own subcategory of graffiti, it would be forced to follow some of graffiti's fundamentals, and it would also be forced to create slightly altered art form specific fundamentals for its own subcategory. But because the mission of anti-style is to not follow any of the basics, it can't successfully do that. And anti-style doesn't have a formulaic, consistent fundamental set because the whole mission of anti-style is to not have fundamentals. But this is something we could even test. You see, if you ask 100 different comic book artists what the fundamentals of comic books are, they'd give you the same answer. If you asked 100 different professional animators what the fundamentals of animation are, they would all give you the same answer as well. And the same thing with professional portrait artists, landscape artists, so on and so forth. But by all means, let's see if we can get 100 different people who do anti-style to give me the same list of fundamental set for anti-style. And if you can't show me a consistent fundamental set, then guess what? You haven't created a subgenre of graffiti. And if 100 people who do anti-style do show me a consistent fundamental set, then you played yourself, because now you're not doing anti-style per your own rules. Now you see, the issue here becomes once they decide to actually conform to creating their own subcategory, what they would end up doing is creating a derivative form of graffiti, just like 3D graffiti is derivative of normal graffiti. And this would result in them just being an abstracted form of graffiti, which once again would lead them to just already being categorized as an already existing abstract art, like expressionism or cubism or so on and so forth, depending on how you go about doing your anti-styles. The same way Picasso can do a portrait, but it'd be a cubistic portrait, this genre of anti-style would still be graffiti, but it would be cubistic graffiti, or it would be expressionistic graffiti, so on and so forth. It wouldn't be anti-style in that case. Now we have one last form of anti-style, and this is if you somehow fail at doing anti-style and you weren't capable of disbanding all of graffiti's fundamentals, as a result you still retain some of graffiti's fundamentals, then all you've done is produced poorly done graffiti that doesn't follow the fundamentals and also wasn't able to follow anti-style's basics. It's literally the equivalent of failing at a portrait and then saying, oh no, that's abstract art. That's what that form of anti-style is. The justification of not understanding the basics. Now for some common arguments I oftentimes hear, one of the worst ones being, oh, you just don't understand anti-style, despite the fact that you just explained it in great depth and you still don't understand it just because you're not from XYZ location. And this argument is ridiculous because I can easily turn that argument right back around and say, I guess that's why you're incapable of understanding and doing regular graffiti, because you're not from the United States. And then the naysayers go silent, I hear the crickets, and I realized I murdered them. Sorry, but you see how that argument falls flat on its face? You don't have to be from a specific location to understand the art form. You just have to know the fundamentals, which it's clear to say, though people who say that sort of thing clearly don't know the basics. I also hear a lot of people, and kind of to touch on this earlier, a lot of people say that, you know, it doesn't follow the rules of graffiti. In which case, that kind of destroys itself, because if it doesn't follow the rules of graffiti, then it's not graffiti and it's just an abstract art. So, you know, enjoy doing abstract art. There's nothing wrong with that, but just come to terms with it. Now, one of the most common arguments I hear a lot is people say graffiti has no fundamentals, which we already debunked that, and I'll be honest, most of the arguments for anti-style make absolutely no sense, and they would realize that if they just learned more about fine art. Now for the most well-intentioned but misinformed argument that people throw my way, and that is art is subjective, and as a result, it can't really be critiqued or defined, and also because of that reason, the rules are unnecessary to follow. And with this one, you actually have a point to a point. You see, because art is subjective, that much is true, but the only part of art that is actually subjective is whether or not you like it. But how the art form is done, what the art form is, and whether or not it's good or bad, those are all objective truths. But just because something is good doesn't mean you have to like it, and just because something is bad doesn't mean you can't like it. The example I like to use here is a kid can draw an objectively bad drawing, and their mother may love the drawing. Her opinion of the artwork is subjective, but it is objectively bad. And if we look at what you guys think about it, my homie Sive here goes ahead and drops some insight about anti-style, while KB on the other hand thinks anti-style is more so that third category of anti-style I talk about, the simply just bad graffiti that people are trying to justify. DVD says as long as you got the basics down, which immediately means it's not anti-style because its whole entire mission is to not follow the basics. And then we have Durst and I going ahead and agree. Wems believe it's a more abstract form of graffiti, which we essentially said here, with the first two categories of anti-style, and Chad and I agree somewhat, once again explaining how I actually end up liking the more abstract form of anti-style that does not resemble graffiti at all whatsoever. So in a nutshell, you got three categories of anti-style. One that is honestly not anti-style at all, it's just abstract art. One that could be a subgenre of graffiti, sharing a relationship with graffiti similar to how cubistic portraits share a relationship to normal portraits. That's the second category. And then you have the last category, just horribly done graffiti that's trying to be justified as its own individual style. But guys, that pretty much wraps up today's video. Let me know your thoughts about it in the comments down below. And if you're new here, feel free to subscribe to the smartest graffiti community anywhere online. We got the best how to do graffiti tutorials right up here, with even more graffiti content right over here. As always, I want to thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you guys next week. Until then, peace.